The first trend I want to talk about is the emergence of a post-Western world. And just to go back a second, I do want to talk about those trends because we can't analyze foreign policy. We can't talk about the role of Brazil in a vacuum. It's really important to say, well, what is Brazil's role? And we can talk about that, but at the same time, we have to understand in what kind of world do we live in today, and what should Brazil's role be in that world. So the first trends will be kind of to set the stage for us to understand what kind of world we live in and what kind of world we will be living in maybe 50 years from now, and what Brazil's and India's role should be in that kind of world. And before I say post-Western world, I'd like to highlight the fact that we have, for the past 500 years, lived in a very much in a Western world. And most people aren't really aware of the fact of how much the West really influenced everything in the world, not even non-Western cultures. The guy on the left here is Columbus, who roughly 500 years ago went out to look for India and hit the Western Hemisphere. And I think that move represents the superiority, the military and technical superiority of Western civilization, because that was the moment when the Western countries set out to occupy large parts of the globe. And this 1492 is what people usually refer to as the beginning of modernity as well. So for the next century or two, countries like France, the UK, the Netherlands went to all these places and actually ended up occupying most of the planet. So, for example, 200 years after that, Western powers occupied basically everybody who lived on the planet. And that wasn't only militarily, but Western ideas and values have had a huge influence on the way everybody thinks. For example, we look at the nation state, which is a Western idea. So the whole world nowadays organizes itself as nations, and that's a Western idea. We have even African countries are Western creations, right? The West came to Africa and cut the continent to pieces, and those are today the countries. The way we measure time, for example, is a Western idea as well. So even in China nowadays, we are in 2009. So even places all over the world, the West supposedly discovered places in faraway regions and named them Mount Everest, Victoria Falls. So we have this intense influence. And also one other thing, all kinds of political and economic philosophies that exist today in the world are all Western. So we have communism, fascism, democracy, all kinds of ways to organize that you can think of, all Western ideas. One interesting thing, I think, is that Western people often think that that's because of the superiority of Western values. And that, I think, is obviously not the case, but this happened, and the West was able to impose itself on the world because of technical and military superiority. So, and it was not done with soft power. It wasn't done because it was more attractive, but because the West had the hard power to impose itself on different cultures and different peoples. Now, so we have the Western world. And now this guy, does anybody know this guy? No? Okay, I don't know this guy either, but it's a former Lehman employee, actually. And I took this picture because during the crisis, I lived in New York for a while, and this guy has just packed up his stuff, and Lehman Brothers has just closed, and New York was full of those people for a while. It was really amazing. You saw those depressed bankers, in suits, carrying out all their files. And Lehman Brothers was actually the beginning of the financial crisis, and there's a lot of people today who say that in 200 years from now, historians or political scientists will mark that year as the end of a 500-year reign of Western dominance. And obviously that's a big statement, and we can't tell for sure, but the crisis that we've that we've lived today, that hasn't really hit Brazil at all in comparison to America, and that hasn't had India or China really, is the first time that we have a financial crisis that originated in a rich country, that had a terrible impact in America and in Europe, and that didn't really hit the non-Western regions of the world. So that's why more and more people say that this crisis could be regarded kind of as a beginning of the emergence of a post-Western world. We have different poles of power that are not located in the traditional Western regions. So that's why when I talk about a power shift, I really want to talk about a hard power shift. And I do want to specifically lay emphasis on the economic aspect of hard power. Because here, when you look at military expenditure, you can see that 41% of all global military expenditure is still done by the Americans. So America has actually more military power than China, France, the UK, Russia, and maybe another 5 countries combined. So there's no question that we still, in a military sense, live in a totally Western American world which is dominated. But economic power is more important because in 2050, those countries will have the economic means to purchase an army that is much larger than that that the Americans have right now. So this is a much better indicator of future power. The economic power today is a very good indicator of military power in the future. And I think those numbers are really amazing. You have the BRICS. The BRICS here are probably very known to everybody, right? Okay. So you have 16% of global GDP, and only 7 years later it goes up to 23, and for the first time it's bigger than American GDP. So in theory, if all those 4 countries, I mean they're very different countries, but if the BRIC countries, you take them together, they have a larger GDP than America, and that's really historic. And in 2050, that's a study here by Goldman Sachs that everybody probably knows. It's called Dreaming with the BRICS. And the Goldman Sachs actually coined the term BRICS. And it was initially an investment category, but this study that they've produced here is a forecast over using past figures to forecast economic growth for the next 4 decades. And that's the list that is now, at least in the circles of political science, widely accepted. So you have China as the largest economy in the world, you have the US second, which are still dominating, and then you have India, Japan, and Brazil. So of the traditional other powers, there's no Germany, there's no United Kingdom or France in there. So you have a really different situation than you have today. And some of the figures that we read in the newspaper today are indicative. For example, China is now the biggest car market in the world. And over 75% of the growth after the crisis has been generated only by China and India. So there's been no growth in the traditional powerful centers of the world. So that's actually the first trend of the 3 that I'll talk about. The second trend is the emergence of global challenges. So just to summarize, we have the first trend, we have a shift of power from traditional powerful countries to new countries, to emerging countries like China, India, and Brazil. And the second is a new type of problem that cannot be solved by the usual problem-solving strategy. The usual problem-solving strategy was to get a small amount of countries, usually 7 countries together, which then formed the G7 later on to fix global finance, to try to fix poverty, and it actually now turns out that those problems are problems that can't be solved like that anymore. And I think climate change is a very obvious example. No country in the world can close its borders and say we don't care about climate change, right? Because the cause and effect is totally displaced. So there's no tie to that. If somebody pollutes in China, somebody in Brazil feels the effect of that. And at the same time, if you think now about Brazil's role, we could say that's really a great opportunity for Brazil to assume leadership, right? Because the whole point of this is to think about how can Brazil increase its leadership, how can Brazil increase its power. And suddenly you have problems that require the participation of a lot of countries. So Brazil, if you think about it, it says, well, that's wonderful. We can assume leadership.